Welcome to the teaching ministry of Lakeside Alliance Church. We are a movement of people who are passionate about pursuing Jesus Christ. If you're in Southeast Wisconsin, join us on a Sunday morning and consider partnering in a mission that matters. For now, sit back and open your heart as we hear from Pastor John.
Only twice in my life have I gone to Jimmy John's, that establishment of fine dining, and been bold enough to order the gargantuan sandwich, right? If you're not familiar with this 16-inch, 1,100 calorie, first-rate wonder of the sandwich world, I can tell you, eating it is no small feat. That even makes it look less than what it really feels like when you're eating it. It's huge. It leaves you with a Thanksgiving dinner level of fullness, okay? It's not something to take lightly. It's a commitment, okay? You're going to need to sit down afterwards. You're going to need to digest it afterwards. You're going to need time for that. And I mentioned that today because we have a gargantuan size of text that we have to handle as we continue our sprint through the book of Hosea. Today we're going to handle the next chunk of chapters 8 to 11 of this book. And so I'm going to recommend that you actually take time to digest this later on. Take time to reread these chapters and allow them to sink in. But for this morning, here's how we're going to consume it. All right, first, chapters 8 to 10, we're going to survey 3 very serious traps to avoid, and then we're going to conclude in chapter 11 with one hope that we're to persevere in. And as we work through these chapters, I want you to bear in mind what we've already learned when it comes to Hosea. The message of this prophetic book sees our faithlessness, our unfaithfulness, as this opaque backdrop for God's faithfulness. This is a theme that has been first played out in Hosea's own personal life with his family, as he has married a promiscuous woman who eventually became an outright harlot. And while she has shredded their marriage covenant and she's bearing all kinds of consequences and brought all kinds of consequences as a result, Hosea nonetheless still goes out and actually has to buy her back in order to restore their relationship. That's chapters 1 through 3. And God has used this then as a parallel to talk about his relationship with the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel, which is sometimes referred to by their largest tribe, Ephraim, or their capital city, Samaria, kind of like how we could refer to sometimes like Washington in reference to the United States or something like that. That's what's going on. And this is a country that for 200 years has run further and further and further from God's covenant agreement with them. It's been this sad marathon led by 19 evil kings, one right after the other, that have charged off in this direction. So in chapters 4 through 7 and 8 through 11, we have a series of prophetic utterances. They're kind of like poems in some ways that flow out, and they are messages from the Lord to the people of Israel. And they're filled with imagery and historical references of all kinds that showcase Israel's sin from all kinds of different angles. And then the consequences that are coming as a result, and will be coming at the hands of the Assyrian Empire, and eventually fell in 722 BC. And through these indictments, though, a sort of wisdom can be learned by us today. That kind of wisdom, as C.S. Lewis termed it, a way of learning by way of the opposite, right? Learning from a bad example. And so we have this opportunity to learn from the snares that Israel was trapped by so that we can avoid them, or so that we can be implored to escape them by God's mercy and our repentance. This is, in fact, actually the exact kind of learning that Hosea directs us to do in the last verse of the book. Hosea 14:9, it says this, "Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but the transgressors stumble in them." All right, so to put that directly then into practice, let's look at this very first trap that we might not stumble, which is trap number 1, the trap of misplaced faith. Misplaced faith. In chapter 8, Hosea's warnings are pictured like a trumpet blast. You can turn there with me. Chapter 8. We'll go through the chapter at a time here, but these are pictured as warning blasts to a city of the danger of God's judgment, that it's likened then to a bird of prey that's about to sweep down it and snatch Israel up like a miniature chihuahua, and that's what's going on. And so there's trumpet blasts going on with Hosea giving these messages that they have breached their covenant agreement with the Lord. He's going to showcase that here first, though, through misplaced faith, and several examples of it, starting in verse 4, saying this, "They, Israel, made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold, they made idols for their own destruction. I have spurned your calf, O Samaria." We'll come back to that in a second. "My anger burns against them," being Samaria, again Israel. "How long will they be incapable of innocence? For it is from Israel, a craftsman made it. It's not God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces." All right, now to keep us tracking together, this calf here was an idol. It would have been larger and more ornate than this, but this is a similar one that was discovered, and it's from the 12th century, from the same region. Famous site that discovered this. And this calf idol was a deity that was worshipped for fertility and for power, right? And as the text lays out, kings, idols of fertility and power and others, and wealth that they have invested in these things were the places where Israel had placed their faith. And so God mocks then how Israel was drawing their sense of confidence from these things of their own creation. Israel is refusing to trust in the Lord and subsequently then his ways for life, for children, for provision, for security, for value, for help, and so on and so forth. Instead, they have trusted in all these other places of their own making, but in the face of God's coming judgment, what has looked wise to them and what oftentimes looks wise to the world is shown to be nothing less than worthless nonsense. God then goes on to make this point just abundantly clear in verses 7 through 10 as he describes Israel's behavior around this like a farmer who has nothing to show for their field, right? Or like a pot that nobody has any use for. Or like a donkey that has wandered off and is all alone without purpose. Or like a prostitute who must hire her clients. That's how pathetic this misplaced faith is in light of God's coming judgment. And that's what's about to swoop down through the Assyrians and through their invasion. A judgment that will just show how utterly misplaced Israel's faith has been. And their leaders, and their wealth, in foreign alliances, in this calf, and elsewhere. But of course, we can actually fall into this very same trap, can't we? When it comes to misplaced faith. We can all have, and we do, we have all kinds of means that we trust in, right? But we can trust in them even to the point of compromising our faith to maintain something or to get something, our security, or our value, our joy, our provision from them. It may not be a king. It may not be a calf-shaped idol. It may not be gold and silver or foreign alliances like Israel, but it might be having our political party in power. It might be science or technology that we're pinning our hopes on for health. It might be our bank account or our job that we trust in for our security. We may have easily wrapped up our value in a relationship with someone. We all use means to get ends, but when we use the wrong means to get something, or we compromise our integrity in how we're using something, or we pin way too much of our hope on it, then Hosea would point out that we've forgotten the Lord and that we have instead fallen into the trap of misplaced faith. When we do, the circumstances of life in a broken and a sinful world, and God himself in discipline and in judgment, act like a refining fire, drawing out that misplaced faith up to the surface. Pressure, pain, problems reveal misplaced faith. It shows up. It shows up when something goes wrong, then with our political plan, and we have despair. It shows and says a lot about where our confidence is. Or when our job is terminated, our panic says a lot about where we place our security. And when that relationship falls apart and our crushed identity results, well, it shows a lot about how we understood our value. Hardship oftentimes reveals misplaced faith. In contrast to those reactions, author and counselor Ed Welch tells a very different story of how one close friend facing a difficult diagnosis responded. He writes this. He says, "Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed." That's the first thing my friend said after he was told that his cancer was malignant and untreatable. It seemed to me that everything had changed. With 4 words, "Your cancer is malignant," his future was forever rearranged. In a little over a year, his parents would lose their oldest son. His wife would become a widow. His 4 young children would lose their father. And I would lose a dear friend. But my friend meant something different than you might think. The hour before he was given his prognosis, he was certain that Jesus was the reigning king. He was certain that Jesus' kingdom was initiated with power at his resurrection and ascension. He was certain that Jesus' love was established beyond any doubt when he died for those who held him in contempt. That his heavenly Father would care for his wife and children with a unique affection. These are just a few of the things crammed into "Nothing has changed." Church, watch out for the trap of misplaced faith by rightly seeing your source of life as being from the Lord. Don't trust the wrong means for your life. Don't over-trust or twist good ones into accomplishing something that they weren't meant to give you. Instead, keep your trust in Jesus. Regularly exercise it by worshiping him and by taking him at his word. And when, not if, but when the crisis occurs, take note of your heart's response and guide it with the Lord's help in the right direction, so that with that job loss, that defeat, that health emergency, or that relational catastrophe, all of which is only but a half step away in each of our lives, you too can know that nothing has changed because of where you've placed your faith. But that's not all. What about the second trap here? The trap of religiosity. The trap of religiosity. A few verses into chapter 8, or at the end of chapter 8 and chapter 9, show how Israel had this veneer of religious activity that in no way fooled God, in no way indebted him to them or curried his favor like it was oftentimes believed that it would do among the pagan gods of the day. And so from chapter 8, verse 11 to chapter 9, verse 6, Israel's religious activities, they come under indictment. Right? From the altar to a kosher diet is thrown in there. You see offerings, festivals appointed in the Old Testament. All these things are brought up to show the superficial activities were functioning as nothing more than dirty rags, only serving to spread the mud around all the more. And in verse 7, as God is laying this out, he says, the days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. The spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. It's not real clear there, but it's likely that Israel is saying this about Hosea, that he's the fool, he's mad. Why are they saying this? The prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God. Yet a fowler snare is on all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. They, Israel, have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. Right? Gibeah is an Old Testament reference from the book of Judges, chapters 19 to 21, where one of the worst atrocities ever committed by the nation of Israel is recorded. It's something that makes you want to throw up when you read. God is saying, though, here, that that's the level of evil that's actually going on, and the people of Israel are hardly even aware of it. They hardly even see it. And they're hoping to cover up what they do see with some religious activities. God detests that kind of religiosity, which is why the rest of this chapter details then the decimating judgment that's coming upon them. A judgment so heavy that it actually prompts the prophet in the midst of it to throw out this prayer to the Lord in verse 14 to deprive Israel of children so that children might not have to go through the suffering that this nation is going to be rocked by. The Assyrians were known for brutal tactics, especially in victory. And yet Israel, in all their foolish pride, is just steering straight towards this catastrophe. So take note here. It's, by the way, Israel's corrupt faith that has steered the nation into this failure. It's not the other way around. Israel's hollow religious observances have fed policies of their state straight into destruction. And church, don't think for a moment that this trap of mere religiosity is something that we couldn't fall into as well, because it's all around us. I remember one blatant example of this at a wedding I was at a few years back. I was sitting at a table with a doctor, and when people find out I'm a pastor at an evangelical church, all kinds of things come out. You know, I never really know what's going to be said next. And this guy piped up then, and he said, "Hey, that's great," kind of in a joking way. That's great. You know, for me, growing up, my dad was Lutheran, so I got baptized there. My mom was Methodist, so we went to church there. When I got married, my wife was Catholic, so now I'm Catholic. And then with a laugh, he said, "Heck, I'll play for anybody." And this sadly funny line, unfortunately, it perfectly captures this trap of religiosity that so many people have fallen into today. So let me tell you, this outward veneer of, well, I've got this church resume thing going on, it's worth about as much as a $3 bill. It's a trap, and its results are so destructive. And so Lakeside, I want to help us to see this. Right? Here's 3 examples of how this can look in everyday life. One example of this religious facade is a syncretistic view of faith that says something like, it doesn't matter what church you go to, just as long as you go to church. Right? Maybe you've heard that one. But friend, there's a reason why the number one concern with the church in the New Testament was false teaching. Just because there's a church in every corner does not mean that the gospel is preached on every corner. Several churches in our own town have abandoned the gospel. They've abandoned the authority of Scripture. They offer nothing but this coating of religiosity. They're not all the same. The next example would be a flippant view that usually follows this of sin. This says, God doesn't care what you do as long as you're not really hurting anyone. Right? That's a moral statement that attempts to actually make yourself God. And it will not work. It's an empty morality that is the byproduct of thinking that God doesn't really care what you do and that his word is subject to all of our cultural whims. We can just make it say what we want it to say. And while it pretends to offer our conscience a way out, it is an argument that will not hold water before God. Now, one last example here is if it sees sincerity as the earmark of truth, all right, rather than the Word of God. It oftentimes comes out with lines like, they really believe that, and really, that's all that matters. Friends, people can believe something sincerely and be sincerely wrong, and we should know destructive consequences can follow and will follow. Destructive consequences are on the line. So don't fall for any of these cheap fakes that are just simply religious traps. Brings us to Hosea's last trap, though, trap number 3. Trap of national success. As with other sources of confidence and religious observance, so national success proved to just be another trap for Israel, as it only served to swell their pride. Their national success succeeded in pushing out any fear of the Lord that would have kept that nation in check. In chapters 9 and 10, the Lord starts by describing Israel as this luscious fruit, right? Or this luxuriant vine, or this wonderful calf. These are 3 agrarian images that just seem so full of promise. But we find that all of them sadly disappoint. Like fruit that proves to be worthless, a vine that is unproductive, and a calf that is the incarnation of stubbornness, so is Israel. Listen to how Hosea speaks of this last example in chapter 10, verse 11, saying this: Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck, but I will put Ephraim to the yoke. Judah must plow, Jacob must harrow for himself. Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love, break up your fallow ground, for it's time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. You have plowed iniquity. You've reaped injustice. You've eaten the fruit of lies because you have trusted in your own way, in the multitude of your warriors. Therefore, the tumult of war shall arise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be destroyed, and Shalman, as Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle, mothers were dashed to pieces with their children. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, because of your great evil. At dawn, the king of Israel shall be utterly cut off. Wow. You can hear all of these metaphors being brought together at the end. Israel had so much potential, and they used it all for sin. And with their great army, it's going to prove to be worthless. With their awesome religious center, which was Bethel, it's going to be destroyed. And their king is going to die. All of their national success that they feel so proud of is going to be destroyed overnight. And in the end, it will only have served as a trap for their pride. Of course, for us, our trap of success, perhaps, yes, as a leading superpower of the world, can easily take a national form, but it could just as easily be a social, relational, financial, or otherwise kind of form. In pride over our success, we can fail to use it for what God had given it to us for doing what is right, for what is true, for what is good. And instead with it, we can forget the Lord and we can do our own thing, right? Maybe we won't forget him like literally, but personal or corporate achievement, it oftentimes leads to greater demands and greater opportunities for personal pleasure. And while along the way, we may make all kinds of promises like, once we accomplish this, or once we finish such and such, right, then, we're going to make time for the Lord. Then we're going to go to church, we're going to give, we're going to study the Bible, right? Then we'll finally be a better spouse. Then we'll be an attentive parent. Then we'll set healthy boundaries. Then we'll finally deal with that nagging problem. But in our success, we're too busy to ever get around to it. And in that sense, we forget. And so it is a severe mercy when God ruins, or he allows our success to be ruined in order to provide us with a wake-up call so that we remember. Years ago, I got to know a gentleman who he'd come in on Sunday mornings, and he'd sit on the very back row of the bleacher section all alone in our church back in Pennsylvania where I served. He'd come in, he kind of had a serious resting face and kind of a haggard look about him, which attracts a pastor's attention to see how he's doing, and get to know him. And so eventually we were out at coffee one day, and I got to hear a little more of his story. And at the local Starbucks, I began to hear a story being unpacked where he had been an engineer by trade, eventually gone into sales because he was pretty good at everything and good with people. And eventually he had done so well with some other investors, he purchased a small manufacturing company in the area where he was now the CEO. But that wasn't really the case anymore. About 2.5 years prior, as the company was in fact celebrating their best year ever, everything came to a screeching halt. It was discovered that the bookkeeper had made some very serious errors along the way. And in the course of a year, they went from soaring to hemorrhaging, and then to bankruptcy, and soon closure by the time of our coffee. But in the midst of all the nightmare that is, and the layoffs and the losses and the complications and the partners and the paperwork, he ended up on a trip through New York. Along the way, his radio hit upon a pastor who was preaching. His name was Charles Stanley. And in the course of the sermon that he was sharing, that man heard the gospel. And he found the hope of salvation. And in his words, it was like everything finally clicked. And this man, while losing everything else, gained the only thing that mattered most. A friend, time after time, in many different ways, a wake-up call that involves the destruction of our success may not feel like mercy at first, but if God uses a catastrophe to destroy what you counted as success, to humble you, to transform you, to use you in a new and better direction, wouldn't that be best? Might God have, in fact, a better plan for your life and your success than you do? We should certainly watch out for the trap of pride from our success. But we should also be patient in persevering. If God pulls the rug out from under you, know that he does it for what's best. Which brings us to some final and some good news this morning, with the hope of God's compassion in our future restoration. So let's put all of this together here. Israel doesn't trust the Lord. They've put their faith in other things and in people that they can see. Right? Their worship is corrupt, it's fake, it's false. They occasionally do some things on the surface associated with the worship of the Lord, but they're secretly engaged in unimaginable perverseness and evil acts. And since they've got relatively good peace, security, and wealth, as a nation, they think they're doing great. And the prophet who says otherwise is nothing but a kook, right? So they are entrapped by all of their success here. And with all of that, and with judgment guaranteed to come down on them, we should look at what God still says in chapter 11. Verse 1, he declares, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. And the more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with bands of love. I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. His lament goes on in verse 8. It says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst. I will not come in wrath, or can also be translated, I will not come in the midst of your city. It's a sense that God will not destroy every last person, even though destruction is coming. And verse 10, they shall go after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like birds from Egypt, from exile, and like doves from the land of Assyria. And I will return them to their homes, declares the Lord. The only reason why not all hope is lost is because of the great compassion of God. Over and again, the scriptures reveal that God takes no pleasure in suffering and no delight in death. He's just, and his justice is always right and true, but his patience is long, and his heart is quick to show compassion and mercy. And it's his compassion and kindness that keeps him from destroying all of Israel, and instead he speaks of a day when he will call his people home. And it's this hope of God's compassion that will actually lead the Apostle Matthew over 700 years later to look at this exact chapter in verse 1 through the lenses of God's gracious choice in sending the promised Messiah, Jesus. And in Matthew's gospel, Matthew will trace the life of Jesus through the pattern of Israel's history to show how Jesus succeeded where Israel failed, so that God could be both just and compassionate to people. And so just as God called Israel out of Egypt, so God called Jesus like a son who he loved out of Egypt in verse 1. And remember that part of the Christmas story where Jesus had to run to Egypt to avoid Herod. He comes home. That's what this is referencing. And again, how Israel then was faced with the Red Sea. We see that Jesus passed through the waters of baptism. And again, with Israel, when it was tempted in the wilderness, Jesus was tempted for 40 days in the wilderness too. In the same way that Jesus went up to the mountain to deliver the new law through the Sermon on the Mount, Israel received the law on the mountain from God. But where Israel failed, Jesus succeeded, so that through him, the ultimate hope born of God's great compassion could be available to Israel and to you, to me, and to all those who are stuck in traps without any hope. And it is the sending of God's own Son, the greatest expression of God's compassion, of a God who says that there is no trap that is too hard, there is no bridge that is too far when it comes to my mercy. That as Charles Spurgeon put it, God's mercy is so great that you may sooner drain the sea of its water, or deprive the sun of its light, or make space too narrow than diminish the great mercy of God. And so, friend, if you're hearing his roar today, come home. Cry out to the Lord. Make him your trust. Stop settling for mere shallow outward observance of religion and take Christ as your king. Humble yourself to take God at his word. And in response to his great compassion towards you, allow your heart to be flooded with love for him. So that when you are finally home, you are at home with your heavenly Father.